On the morning of November 5th, 2014, in the small town of Sullivan, Indiana, 20-year-old Tiffanie Adams walked out of her father's house and set off toward her mother's home, which sat just about a block away. She was 8 months pregnant with her first child, and it was a walk she had done many times before. It was so close that her mother's front porch could be seen from her father's backyard. But somewhere along that short stretch, Tiffanie vanished. 55 days later, a farmer harvesting a late corn crop found her remains in his field, turning a search for a missing young mother into a double homicide investigation. Tiffanie Renee Adams, known to everyone who loved her as Tiff, was born on June 7, 1994 in Terre Haute, Indiana, to Christina Adams, and was described as a very caring and sweet individual. By the fall of 2014, Tiffanie was 20 years old and living about 40 miles south in Vincennes with her boyfriend, Donnie Barron. She was counting down the days to her New Year's Day due date and had already chosen the name Brynsten for her son. Unfortunately, leading up to this, Tiffanie had been struggling with an addiction to prescription pain pills, and on the last morning of her life, that led her to the one family member she had every reason to keep her distance from, her stepbrother, Jonas Orr. Since Tiffany's biological father was not in her life, she was raised by her mother's first husband, Bruce Adams. However, when Tiffanie was 15, her mother, Christina, abruptly left Bruce for the next-door neighbor, Brian Orr, and they married shortly after. Because they lived so close, Bruce could see right into Brian and Christina's front yard from his own back porch. This is what brought Brian's son, Jonas, into Tiffany's life. Because Bruce was forced to see his ex-wife constantly with her new husband, it created a lot of hostility between the two households. Brian and Bruce had a mutual dislike for one another, and there was a constant tension around the neighborhood. There was also bad blood between the Orr family and Paul McHenry, Tiffany's ex-boyfriend and the biological father of her unborn son. Tiffanie and Jonas had been close at one point, and he even supplied her with pills and money, but that all changed when she began openly complaining to friends and Paul that Brian was being sexually inappropriate towards her. This caused massive friction as Bruce fiercely protected Tiffanie and Jonas sided with his father. Jonas was known for his volatile temper and threatened Tiffanie, saying, "I will kill anyone who messes with my dad." Then in September of 2014, the conflict boiled over. Tiffanie and Jonas's own sister, Mary, had accused him of sexual assault, and Christina took their side, which upset Jonas. So he went to the Sullivan City Police to try to have harassment charges filed against them. Days later, he filed for a protective order against Tiffanie, but the request was never granted. Then came the morning of November 5th, 2014. Around 9 a.m., Bruce Adams drove over to Vincennes, picked up Tiffanie and her current boyfriend, Donnie, and brought them back to his home in Sullivan so Tiffanie could collect some donated baby clothes. Shortly after they arrived, Bruce left to run an errand. While he was gone, Tiffanie told Donnie she was going to walk over to her mother's house to see whether Christina had any pain pills. She took her cell phone with her and left. According to Donnie, Tiffanie never stayed at her mother's more than a few minutes, but this time 30 minutes had passed with no sign of her. When Bruce got home and learned where she had gone, he began calling her phone, but received no answer. That same morning, Jonas had borrowed a Chevy Blazer belonging to a sawmill worker named Jim Fish, after agreeing to run a favor driving Jim's girlfriend to work. This is important because Jonas and his wife Amber didn't own a car at all and typically got around using a golf cart. They also shared a single cell phone, which Amber had with her at home that day. Around 11:15 a.m., Jonas left in the Blazer, supposedly to return it to Jim at the sawmill, a drive that should have taken only a few minutes, but he never arrived. When Jim texted around looking for him, Amber replied that Jonas wasn't home, that she had his phone, and that she was going to go look for him. Then at 11:56 a.m., Amber received a text from a number she didn't recognize. It was, in fact, coming from Tiffany's cell phone. Over the next 15 minutes, a string of messages came from the phone, all of them telling the same story, that the blazer had broken down, that whoever was texting had borrowed a phone from a passing couple to send word, and that he'd be home soon. The messages were riddled with misspellings and amounted to, "It's me, the blazer broke down." When Amber texted back asking who it was, the replies kept insisting he had to hand the phone back to the strangers who had loaned it. While Jonas never came out and explicitly said it was him, it was obvious to Amber from the conversation. Investigators would also later conclude the same thing. Around 1 p.m., Tiffany's father, Bruce, received 3 calls in a row from Tiffany's cell phone. When he answered the first, he heard a man's voice in the background before the line went dead. The second call was silent. On the third, he again heard a man yelling and heard his daughter say, "Dad, Dad." Then the call ended. Bruce called back about 10 minutes later, but every call went to voicemail. The very last recorded use of Tiffany's phone was an outgoing call to her mother, placed at 1:26 p.m. 4 minutes later, Jonas finally arrived at the sawmill in the blazer, about an hour and a half after he was expected to be there. When questioned about the delay, he told Jim that the engine had died. He then borrowed Jim's phone, called Amber, and had her pick him up on the golf cart about half a mile down the road. Later that same afternoon, Jonas and Amber were seen at Christina and Brian's home, and Bruce watched them tinkering with something on the front porch. What was on that front porch was a motion-activated deer hunting camera. The next day, Brian noticed the camera's memory card was missing, which was replaced by Jonas and Amber not long after. 2 days later, when Tiffany was still nowhere to be found, her family reported her missing. For weeks, searches turned up nothing. Then on December 30th, 2014, 2 farmers doing a late harvest of their corn came across her body in a field northeast of town, near the intersection of County Road 300 North and County Road 325 East. One of the farmers saw Tiffany's bright pink shirt and initially thought he was looking at a doll or a piece of trash. Tiffany's body had unfortunately been in the field for more than 2 months and had badly decomposed. A red fleece jacket was knotted tightly around her neck, and a single leaf was found caught inside that knot, a small detail that told investigators she had been killed right there in the field. Her cell phone, however, was still nowhere to be found. An autopsy the next day determined that Tiffany had been strangled to death. Her son, Brynsten, whom the pathologist confirmed was viable and could have survived outside the womb, suffocated when his mother died. Both deaths were ruled homicides. Sullivan County Sheriff Clark Cottom interviewed Jonas twice, once on December 31st, the day after Tiffany was found, and again on January 20th, 2015. In the first interview, Jonas insisted he couldn't have done it, telling the sheriff he didn't even own a vehicle and that he and his wife were together, in his words, day in and day out. But by the second interview, his story had shifted. He was now admitting that he had used the blazer that day and had been alone in it at different times. However, he stuck to the story that the blazer broke down and he had borrowed a helpful stranger's phone. But investigators already knew from cell phone records that the text messages were from Tiffany's phone, not a random stranger. That same day, Jonas was arrested and charged with 2 felony counts of murder. Regardless, investigators still wanted to find Tiffany's phone in order to build an airtight case against him. So on August 27, 2015, using cellular data tracking, they were able to locate her cell phone in Lake Sullivan, about half a mile from where Jonas claimed the blazer broke down. When investigators checked the phone, they found that every text sent from the phone that day had been deleted. However, the Indiana State Police Cyber Crimes Unit was able to recover them word for word. Meanwhile, a state forensic scientist found red fibers inside the borrowed blazer and suggested they could have come from the same red jacket found knotted around Tiffany's neck. And an FBI cell phone analyst mapped the towers Tiffany's phone had pinged in her final hour and found the path ran from near where her body was found toward the lake where her phone was later dumped. Then there was one more piece of evidence. While in jail, Jonas and another inmate were watching a television program about an unsolved murder when the inmate said that Jonas made the following remark, "You'd be amazed at what you can live with when you have to." According to that witness, Jonas also said that he didn't feel sorry for what he had done to Tiffanie, but that he felt bad about the baby and asked whether God would forgive him. Jonas went to trial in June 2016 and, after 5 days, was found guilty of the murders of both Tiffanie and her unborn son, Brynsten. Weeks later, he was sentenced to 60 years for each murder, to be served consecutively, meaning he's required to spend 120 years total in prison. He later appealed, arguing among other things that the evidence was too thin to support a conviction. However, in February 2018, the Indiana Court of Appeals rejected every argument and affirmed both his convictions and his sentence. As for a motive, Jonas claimed he committed the murder to protect his family name and defend his father. Months after he was put behind bars, his wife Amber filed for divorce. Then Christina filed for divorce from Brian. In the end, all Jonas did was completely tear his family apart. On the night of Friday, November 17, 1978, in the small town of Speedway, Indiana, best known as the home of the Indianapolis 500, 4 young employees were closing down the Burger Chef restaurant on Crawfordsville Road for the night when they all strangely vanished. When a fellow employee dropped by at around midnight, he found the restaurant eerily quiet, lights on, the safe open, the back door ajar, and the purses and jackets of the 2 young women still sitting inside. What at first looked like a handful of teenagers who had grabbed the cash and taken off quickly became one of the most notorious and heartbreaking unsolved murders in Indiana history. The oldest employee that night was the assistant manager, 20-year-old Jayne Friedt, who was born on May 2, 1958 in Terre Haute, and was described by classmates and coworkers as full of life and someone who was quick with a joke. The next employee was 17-year-old Ruth Ellen Shelton, who was born on December 19, 1960 in Indianapolis and was a junior at Northwest High School. She was very academic, always making the honor roll, and had loaded up on business and math courses with a plan to study computer science in college, something very ambitious for the time. When she wasn't studying, she was practicing the piano and singing, and was also involved in the youth ministries at the West Side Church of the Nazarene. Then there were 2 16-year-olds. The first was Daniel Roy Davis, who went by Danny, who was born on September 6, 1962, one of 3 children. The second was Mark Flemmonds, who was born on December 31, 1961, the youngest of 7 children, and raised in a devout Jehovah's Witness household. Friends described him as a kind and upbeat individual. Unfortunately, Mark wasn't even supposed to be in the restaurant that night, but had worked to cover a shift for a fellow coworker who had other plans. Speedway, Indiana in 1978 was a town of fewer than 13,000 residents and was already on edge from a series of 8 random explosions that occurred between September 1st and September 6th of that year. Those bombings were later linked to a man named Brett Kimberlin, who was ultimately sentenced to 50 years in prison for the crime, but only served 15 and was released in 2001. Investigators looked into a possible connection, but never found one. The employee who arrived at Burger Chef on the night of the tragedy was Brian Kring, and after finding the restaurant empty, he immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they found that roughly $581 was missing from the safe, but more than $100 in coins had been left untouched in the registers. Rather than treat it as an abduction, investigators leaned toward a far less alarming theory that the 4 teenagers had helped themselves to the cash and gone out partying. On that assumption, the restaurant was cleaned up and reopened for business the very next morning. No crime scene photographs were taken, and no one dusted for fingerprints. Whatever evidence the killers might have left behind was wiped away when the restaurant was cleaned. However, that initial theory began to fall apart when Jayne's white 1974 Chevrolet Vega was found abandoned in town with the doors unlocked, not far from the Speedway police station. Then, on Sunday, November 19th, 2 days after the teens disappeared, 2 Johnson County residents walking their wooded property near Stones Crossing Road, about 20 miles south of Speedway, made a horrifying discovery. In the woods were the bodies of all 4 employees, still in their burger chef uniforms. Danny and Ruth had been shot several times with a .38 caliber handgun, and Jayne had been stabbed in the chest with a knife that was still in her. So much force had been used that it broke the handle of the knife off. The last victim, Mark, was found some distance from the others, having been beaten, and the coroner determined that he had died of asphyxiation after choking on his own blood, which led investigators to believe he had been running for his life in the dark when he struck his head and collapsed. Tragically, the victims still had cash and watches on them, ruling out robbery as the sole motive. From there, the case became a desperate search for answers that would stretch across decades. A multi-agency task force was formed, and Burger Chef's parent company even put up a $25,000 reward, and while leads reached as far as Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Chicago, and even Dallas, Texas, nothing led investigators to their killer or killers. The strongest early lead came from an eyewitness, a 16-year-old boy who, along with his girlfriend, had seen 2 suspicious men sitting in a car outside the Burger Chef restaurant just before closing. One of the men told the teenagers to leave, claiming there had been vandalism in the area, all while holding a handkerchief to his mouth and keeping his head low. The witness described both men as white and in their 30s, one with a beard and the other clean-shaven with light-colored hair. Police used that description to build composite sketches. This information also led police to the theory that the victims were abducted during a robbery gone wrong because one of them had recognized one of the suspects. Because Mark wasn't scheduled that night, they believe he might have been the one who recognized one or both of the men. Over the years, several persons of interest were identified. The first was a man named David Cathcart, who bragged to people in a bar in nearby Greenwood that he'd been involved. Because he strongly resembled the police sketch of the bearded suspect seen near the restaurant on the night of the crime, law enforcement sent undercover officers to investigate and subsequently arrest him. However, upon formal questioning by police, he quickly changed his tune and denied any actual involvement. He then passed a polygraph, but before being released, he provided investigators with several associates he claimed belonged to a local fast food robbery gang. This tip triggered a massive new line of investigation into a ring of regional armed robbers. However, police could never find any physical evidence to tie the group to the homicides. Years later, Cathcart died after taking his own life. In 1984, the case took a dramatic turn when a man named Donald Forrester, who was serving time in an Indiana prison, contacted a Marion County detective and said he wanted to talk. Facing a transfer he was desperate to avoid, Forrester confessed that he had taken part in the Burger Chef murders and said he was the one who shot Danny and Ruth. He went on to describe details of the crime that only the killers would have known, such as the location of the bodies, the broken handle of the knife, and the caliber of the murder weapon. He claimed he'd flushed the spent shell casings down his toilet and then went on to describe in detail the events of the night. He said the whole thing started over a drug debt that a relative of Jayne's owed. He said he and several associates had gone to the restaurant to threaten her, but Mark had stepped in, a struggle broke out, and Mark was fatally injured. He said at that point the group decided to abduct and kill everyone in order to eliminate the witnesses. He named other men he said were responsible for killing Jayne and Mark, and he led police to a river where he claimed he had thrown the gun, but searchers were unable to find anything. For a moment, it looked as though the case might finally be solved. However, when investigators secured a search warrant for his former residence and searched the septic tank, they found .22 caliber shell casings, not .38 caliber. There was also a problem with one of the names he had provided to investigators. One of the men Forrester claimed had been involved was actually in prison on the night of the murders. Then there was how he obtained a good bit of the information. Allegedly, investigators had brought him into their investigation room, which allowed him access to see crime scene photographs and case files. It basically fed him all the hidden details he later parroted back to investigators as inside knowledge. Forrester would eventually recant his confession once someone on the inside of the investigation leaked his name. He then refused to cooperate any further and died in prison of cancer in 2006. Most modern investigators believe Forrester was a chronic, violent criminal who lived near the area, knew the woods well, and likely heard genuine rumors or secondhand information from the actual criminal underworld. He used a real, unrelated memory of flushing unrelated ammunition down his toilet to build a terrifyingly realistic, yet ultimately fraudulent, confession to manipulate his prison placement. In the decades since, the Burger Chef murders have remained in the minds of locals. One Indiana State Police investigator, Stoney Vann, carried the case for 20 years before retiring in 2018 and called it the one case that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation remains open, and over the years, detectives have looked at whether modern DNA methods might finally produce an answer. In 2018, the community planted 4 red oak trees at Leonard Park in Speedway, one for each victim, with a marble bench dedicated to their families. And in 2024, the old building on Crawfordsville Road was finally torn down. But the central question remains: who murdered 4 young people on a November night in 1978? If you or anyone you know has information about the Burger Chef murders, please call the Indiana State Police at 317-899-8577 or 1-800-582-8440 and reference case number 44-14915. Jayne Friedt, Ruth Ellen Shelton, Danny Davis, and Mark Flemmonds were murdered on November 17, 1978, and as of 2026, this case remains unsolved.